What is up, Bitcoiners? Welcome to the Bitcoin Magazine Proof of Keys live stream and the happy birthday to Bitcoin. Happy 12th birthday to Bitcoin. I'm super excited to have Alex Gladstein here to do this AMA. He is someone who's really been pushing Bitcoin privacy, sovereignty, Bitcoin adoption on a very real and usable level. Alex, welcome to the stream.
Happy to be here. It's an exciting day for Bitcoin and for freedom around the world, and a bad day for dictators everywhere.
So, Alex, I guess before we get into the listener questions, want to just, get your take on 2020. Like, what a crazy, absolutely crazy year for Bitcoin, absolutely crazy year for the planet. Just kind of like looking back, if there was like a overarching lesson or takeaway that you can take from 2020, what would that be?
It would be that authoritarians around the world are going to use any opportunity to expand their power and crack down on civil liberties and cement their control over society. So out of China a year ago popped up a new opportunity for them. And of course, for citizens, it's been a harrowing year filled with economic shutdown, filled with disease, filled with death. But for them, it was an opportunity to expand their power and control. And, it sounds maybe a little tinfoil hat, for people in, let's say, Canada or the United States, perhaps, but not so in other countries. And, in dictatorships, the government absolutely used this opportunity to level up their control apparatus. I mean, just as an example, in China, during the March and April period, people for the first time had to show a particular color on their phone to leave their apartment building in certain cities, or else they weren't allowed to leave. And that color was not biometric. That color was determined by someone, and that color was, essentially green, yellow, or red. And if you didn't show green, you couldn't go to work, you couldn't leave. And these temporary measures have become permanent. There's the old Soviet joke, right? That there's nothing more permanent than a temporary measure. And these things have just sort of been ingrained into society. And on a maybe less shocking level, you're even seeing that in the West. I mean, we have these sort of like COVID tracking protocols that are being built into our phones. And most people aren't very aware of what's happening, but it's just sort of the gradual normalization of surveillance, I would say, historically is going to be the big civil liberties takeaway from 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like it's true in developing in non-Western countries, but it's absolutely true in Westernized countries too. And you pointed to some of the temporary measures that become permanent. There's a lot of temporary measures in place right now, and we see people really kind of getting up in arms about like how and when they're going to be taken down across the world. So really quickly in the chat, someone said, "Who's Alex?" So I just realized we didn't really do a proper introduction. In the stream, you can see he's the CSO at the Human Rights Foundation. Do you kind of want to talk a little bit about what you do day to day and maybe relate it to Bitcoin too?
Sure. So since before Bitcoin, I've been working at the Human Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit based in New York City that focuses on helping people who live under authoritarian regimes around the world. And to us, tyranny is pretty much the biggest problem for humanity. There's about 4.2 billion people out of the 7.5 today that live under some sort of tyrannical regime, whether it be a military dictatorship, a monarch, an absolute monarch, a junta. We see this everywhere from Xi Jinping in China to Putin in Russia to the Maduro regime in Venezuela, and on and on and on. I mean, most countries, unfortunately, in Africa, the Middle East, are dictatorships. There's about 95 of them around the world. And in every case, the centralization of political power is bad for humans. And it's not just a civil liberties issue. If you actually look at stuff like refugees, where do refugees come from? 95% of them come from dictatorships. People don't flee Norway, let's put it that way. Scientific innovation, look at patent rates. most of the world's creativity, patents, innovations come from open societies, come from democracies. So, you look at anything really, maternal health rates, growth rates. I mean, any sort of socioeconomic data, long term is worse in dictatorships. And this is best exemplified by looking at a satellite image of the Korean Peninsula at night, where you can really strikingly see the difference between, a society that has more freedoms versus a society that has very few freedoms, and it's black and white, right? So we've recognized authoritarianism as basically the biggest challenge facing humanity. I mean, there's more people that live under authoritarianism than suffer from war and conflict, that suffer from natural disasters, that are in absolute poverty. Just to give some numbers there, I mean, there's about 800, 900 million people that lack access to clean drinking water. Sorry, 800 to 900 million people who lack access to clean drinking water, or who lack access to, for example, a job where they can get more than $1 or $2 per day. Yet there's 4.2 billion who live under some sort of tyrannical regime. So we think it's the biggest problem facing humanity. And I've been working at HRF ever since 2007 on different programs to help people who live under these regimes. And throughout my time there, technology as a tool of empowerment has been a constant thread, whether it be our programs to smuggle flash drives with outside information on them into places like Cuba and North Korea, or obviously in the last few years, more recently, unpacking what Bitcoin means for financial freedom, and both kind of advancing and studying how it's making a difference in these societies around the world.
Awesome. That was a very, very comprehensive answer. And I like to point out that you are at HRF pre-Bitcoin, 2007. So pre-Bitcoin,
Yes.
and then HRF kind of seeing Bitcoin come into play and evolve, and then eventually adopting it and start signaling for Bitcoin. Can you kind of talk about how did HRF kind of vet Bitcoin, see Bitcoin, and then ultimately decide to kind of advocate for it?
Yeah, I mean, we were first sort of introduced to Bitcoin in 2013 by some folks who approached us and said they wanted to send money to support activists in Ukraine. And this was obviously late 2013. This was right before the Russians invaded, right? So it was a tough time for Ukrainian civil society, and their bank accounts were being shut down. And folks came to us and said, well, what about this? And we were like, that's interesting. But of course, like most at the time, we didn't really get it. I mean, we looked at it and we thought it was interesting, but we didn't really decide to pursue it at that time. And, let's face it, most people didn't, because it just wasn't something that a lot of people took very seriously at that time. But you know what? Bitcoin has its way. And the next year, in 2014, one of our donors was like, hey, can I donate and make a difference for you guys in Bitcoin? And we were like, sure, let's do it. So we set up an early Coinbase account, and we started taking Bitcoin donations, and that was something that we benefited greatly from for many years. And then in 2017, in the spring of 2017, May 2017, ironically, when Bitcoin was making its big rise from $1,000 to $2,000, that's when we did our first workshop connecting activists to Bitcoin folks. And we've just been trying to increase our programming in that area ever since. And in the past year, we've started funding Bitcoin core development, as well as other free and open source Bitcoin projects through the Bitcoin Development Fund at HRF.
Yeah, you guys entering into the Bitcoin development fundraising space is extremely bullish for 2020 and for Bitcoin. One of our questions is asking, he saw a post from Ray Dillinger kind of criticizing Bitcoin's privacy and saying it's broken.
Mm-hmm.
Not sure if you saw that post. I did not. But he's saying
that
as a privacy advocate and as someone who's kind of pushing for privacy tech development, where do you see the state of Bitcoin privacy? Where can it be improved? Are you hopeful? Kind of what's your overall?
Yeah, I'm very hopeful. I think we need to be realistic, and obviously, privacy was not the number one thing that Satoshi and everyone else who's worked on Bitcoin ever since prioritized as the number one thing, because that wouldn't have been a good way to approach eCash. Instead, they focused on making something that was a good store of value, something that was scarce, something that had a decentralized issuance. Those things we have seen over time are the better substrate for eCash, for digital cash. Now, once you have those things with a programmable substrate, now things start to get interesting. So, from the beginning, there have been many different brilliant people in Bitcoin figuring out ways to make Bitcoin use more private. Those are accelerating. And if you just look at the upgrades, and I mean, it's hard to not to be optimistic if you just look at the last couple of years. If you look at the upgrades to the base protocol, I mean, upgrades that made things like the Lightning Network possible. We have Taproot coming. So, it does seem a little slow, but it's very important for people to understand that digital cash isn't going to help anybody if it's not worth anything. And making it valuable is the most important thing, keeping it valuable. And then over time, we're going to add privacy, and it's going to really become, I think, a very formidable privacy tool in the near future. I mean, it already is in many ways. I think a lot of these critics who are very technical people don't understand what's happening out there in the real world. So there's like a disconnect between technical analysis of Bitcoin privacy in some cases and real world usage. So I'll just give an example. So in Nigeria, a couple months ago, folks were raising funds for protests against police brutality with Bitcoin. I mean, their bank accounts were being turned on, turned off. So, and they were doing it with one address, right? Which obviously, as most folks would know here, is not super safe, because obviously anyone watching can start to understand where that money's going and start to pair the donors and start to see where the funds are flowing. And the government could do that, and that'd be bad. So we encourage them to set up a BTC Pay server instead. So, this is not like some radical privacy breakthrough, but what it does is it's a major improvement in this area, because all of a sudden the people donating are donating to fresh addresses every time that no one else knows. I mean, it's auto generated, and only that person can see it. And then the next person who donates to a new address. So these things seem maybe minor on, perhaps to the technical community, but in practice, they're very important, because all of a sudden it makes, an adversary trying to understand what's going on, it really flusters them. So even basic stuff like BTC Pay server goes a long way, even though you might not think of it as a privacy technology.
I love that example. And I know that there's a lot of Bitcoin critics, even people in the altcoin space, who, will push back on Bitcoin privacy. But the reality is that you can use Bitcoin privately, and now it's just about making that best use case of Bitcoin accessible and liquid, and something that people can actually access and deal with on their own. I guess what excites you about the Bitcoin privacy landscape right now, and where do you see kind of like people building the right tools?
Well, obviously the big bad guy is chain surveillance. So the huge vulnerability of Bitcoin, of course, is in many ways what also makes it powerful is the open ledger, right? Which gives us auditability, which is again chief and primary, can't be compromised. But at the same time, people have developed the Lightning Network, which is pretty breathtaking from just a simple point of view in terms of it just removes your transactions from the blockchain. So like that chain analysis is not very helpful if you and I are transacting in a way that they can't see. And I know it's nation. I know it's slow going, at least in the eyes of critics. But I mean, Lightning continues to develop, and I really do believe, and this took me a while to understand and to build this understanding, but I really do believe that Bitcoin itself is going to be this very auditable, very hyper secure settlement layer. And then, that is what gives the whole system value. And then on top of that, there's going to be layered technologies, and there are going to be these private instant cash layers on top, right? Which do make some trade-offs. And that's just the way the system's going to work. And Lightning is sort of one of the first iterations of that. We'll see how it goes. I'm very bullish about it. But you know what? The great thing is these second layers can experiment. I mean, they can fail. Doesn't impact the value proposition of the underlying layer.
Yep, absolutely.
Doesn't touch it at all. So I'm quite bullish on more and more Lightning usage and adoption, and people transacting and doing micropayments and paying each other, and all this stuff is just much harder to surveil. I mean, nothing's perfect. There's still ways to sort of like game the system and try to figure out what's going on in Lightning, but it's obviously a hell of a lot harder than just looking at transactions on the base layer. But again, even that, I mean, we're looking at this upgrade, which is now being endorsed by 91% of all the miners in the world, Taproot, which basically makes different kinds of transactions on the blockchain look the same. So all of a sudden, you're introducing a huge amount of plausible deniability and confusion to chain analysis folks. You've already got user-level, user-friendly coin joins happening from a bunch of different organizations. These continue to get stronger. And then in the next couple of years, you might even see upgrades like cross input signature aggregation, things like that, which may make privacy tech the economically wise thing to do. I mean, so I think the future is very bright in this area from a technological perspective. And I would just caution people who are upset with Bitcoin's, what they see as like a lack of innovation or an ossification, which has forced them to go off and try to create their own projects. I mean, the value proposition here, I mean, we're talking about money that people will use for hopefully hundreds and hundreds of years. So the fact that you're upset that it's not moving fast enough is not justification for you to go off and create your own project. I mean, try to be open-minded here about the fact that this is a very long-term project, and we need to be very careful about the underlying value proposition.
Yeah, well, I would push back a little bit and say that the fact that people can go off and do their own thing is a positive thing for the fact that Bitcoin can stay what it is and keep iterating its way, and people can experiment elsewhere, and then hopefully something exciting happens.
And I guess this isn't to say that all these privacy coins aren't helpful in some way. They are experimenting with unstable tech that has flaws, and we're getting to see that stuff play out live. And there's a lot of different ways to bring privacy to Bitcoin, and Bitcoin engineers are watching this stuff, and they're going to they're going to make proposals to Bitcoin that make the most sense. So in a lot of ways, all these other coins are like test nets in some ways for understanding what may work and what may not work. And you're always going to have this battle between auditability and privacy. But again, I think they're a combination of base layer upgrades that make transactions essentially indistinguishable over time, and that encourage people to aggregate their transactions with one another over time. This is really going to fluster chain surveillance. And if more and more people can be transacting through networks like Lightning, or even like state chains or different kinds of side chains, I mean, I think there's just so much to be hopeful for in this area.
Yeah, so I want to zoom it out and talk about users and people. I think there's a lot of people in the West who might not appreciate how useful Bitcoin is just as it is today, for people who might not have the assurances and the infrastructure that people in the West have. Can you just talk a little bit about like what Bitcoin is doing for people today and how Bitcoin helps its users today?
Yeah, and here's again, like I support and I encourage all this hardcore privacy research and hand wringing. It's essential. I mean, we all have to be better. But at the same time, we should realize that like the majority of people using Bitcoin are not up against NSA level adversaries who are trying to like micro inspect what they are doing. Most people who are using Bitcoin are in a sense of using it for like remittances, things like that. They're not up against the NSA. So there's a balance between like our need to be cautious and also an understanding that like the world is not just Americans fighting the American government or whatever. It's much more broad than that. And a lot of these other governments are busy, trying just to stay alive. They don't have the time to hire a chain analysis company and go after people. Some of them do, but some of them don't. And just to give an example of how powerful this protocol is right now, what it enables, There are some friends of mine in Nigeria that have created this app called Send Cash. And this to me is just fascinating. And I think right now in Bitcoin's like life cycle, the bridges between fiat and Bitcoin are very, very important, obviously. I mean, maybe like 100 years from now, they won't matter, but like today, they're really, really important. It is what gives Bitcoin its value, is in many ways your ability to turn it into fiat, or to find someone who will buy it from you. I mean, this is really in many ways what has increased adoption, and this increased liquidity and awareness is really like what's like giving Bitcoin a lot more credibility right now. And with this app, anyone with a Bitcoin wallet can send Bitcoin through this phone app, and it can settle in Naira, which is the currency in Nigeria. It can settle in Naira in minutes into like any Nigerian's bank account. So you're using, Bitcoin to bypass like all this nonsense of like, Western Union, and like taking days to send money across borders and extortionate fees and all this stuff. And some scrappy startup, which is now growing into a really impressive company in Nigeria, has figured out a way for them to use Bitcoin as this payment rail, for you to make essentially like instant international deposits of up to a certain amount. I think it's like $2,000 a day or something like that.
Plenty.
That to me is just shocking. And this is a huge country, Nigeria. This is like where a lot of Bitcoin innovation is happening. There are going to be more Nigerians than Americans by 2050. I mean, this is the largest country in Africa. So, I mean, this is like some really exciting stuff. And I think it's a good example of how people have figured out how to use this thing to circumvent the wildly extortionate international remittance scheme. I mean, you're talking about a situation where there's like tens and tens and tens of millions of people around the world who work abroad, send money back home to their family. The average remittance is about $200, and they're paying anywhere from 5 to 15% on that. And it takes time. It can be frozen. We're just talking about throwing that entirely out the window and just being able to do it in less than an hour with this new technology. And that to me is just incredibly powerful, and it's changing the lives of so many people. And it's something that all these Bitcoin critics in the West are totally blind to. I mean, they just don't understand this is happening. They refuse to accept it. They won't even answer me when I ask them about it. So, I mean, you get a lot of these people saying, "Oh, poor people can't buy Bitcoin." I mean, this is nonsense. I mean, people who literally can't afford remittances are turning to Bitcoin to save money and feed their families. This is like happening at a huge scale, and there's just mass denial about it, which I guess we should expect, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is kind of funny that people say poor people can't get a hold of Bitcoin, but the reality is that poor people can't get a hold of dollars. They are systematically either priced out or edged out of the dollar system because of credentialing or not having an address.
Yeah.
Or not have like they can't get dollars. I mean, if they could get dollars, they would. They have to use Bitcoin.
Yeah, and this is an area where like privacy is like the last thing that these people are thinking about right now. I mean, we need to build it because eventually they will need it, but like right now, I mean, they're talking about using Bitcoin as a payment rail and peer-to-peer marketplaces. Their governments have no idea what's going on, and they're just using this as like a better way to move money from point A to point B. And this is kind of like a really like blossoming use case that like we're watching people do over time. And obviously, as the price goes up, it becomes more effective, it becomes more efficient, it becomes even better than using dollars in many ways.
Yep. It's two parallel systems, and then the Bitcoin system is just gaining, right, and becoming more useful. This is proof of keys day, so I want to take it back to kind of storing Bitcoin, holding Bitcoin, using Bitcoin in a self-sovereign way. I'm kind of curious, like when HRF talks to users, maybe users who are a little disadvantaged from a financial perspective, like how are you guys recommending for people to get onboarded onto Bitcoin in a way that is at least minimally viable, protective of them and their sovereignty?
Yeah, I mean, look, this day is very important because the revolution of Bitcoin in many ways is to be your own bank, right? And the activists that we work with around the world are constantly facing financial repression, censorship, seizure. I give one example. This incredible woman that we know is a democracy activist in Nicaragua, which is being torn apart by the Ortega regime. Like this zombie guy who never dies. He's been around since the 80s, forcing his, corrupt socialism on the nation and ruining Nicaragua. It's terrible. But anyway, this woman, she was in government in the opposition, and now she's left and she's a democracy activist. But basically, the government, they just like froze her bank account because they didn't like her. So she has to go to Costa Rica to do her banking. So like if and again, she's not in government anymore, she's in civil society. So if like you wanted to make a donation to her organization, or if she was trying to earn some income to do her work, the government, let's say Bitcoin doesn't exist, the government has figured out a way to totally neutralize her. They just shut down her access to the banking system. So basically she has to go to some other country and then use paper money to move back and forth. I mean, it's very dinosaur and unfortunately very possible for governments to do. So when we were talking to her about a year ago, she was part of a fellowship that we run called the Freedom Fellowship, and we have now incorporated sort of some basic Bitcoin education into this, and we're like explaining this to her that like we can send her any amount of value to her directly, in Nicaragua. She can custody that herself relatively easily, and then she can sell it into fiat whenever she needs to in the peer-to-peer marketplaces without having to go to Costa Rica. I mean, this is like a total game changer for her, complete game changer. So I think that's why proof of keys is so important, is that it just allows them to take control. I mean, there are other folks that we work with where, I'll give another example. There's another person from another authoritarian country, which I won't name, that as part of this program, they had to they paid their own way to go to some other country to get a visa because the line was like super long at the consulate in their country. They're trying to get a visa to come to America. So they spent like $1,000 out of pocket, and we needed to reimburse them, right? So normally what would happen is this person would come to the program in America and we would spend a week together, whatever, and then we would just give them $1,000 in cash, and then they would just like literally secretly try to transport that back to their own home country, like in their clothing, essentially, things like that. And it's terrifying. So we can just completely eradicate that fear and that anxiety, and we can, after the program's done, we'll just, teach this person how to receive Bitcoin on their phone, how to custody it, out of the government has no idea what's going on, and that person can then use peer-to-peer marketplaces to sell this off into fiat as they need to pay program expenses or whatever. And that last piece is so key, right? So maybe that didn't exist in 2013, 2012. Like maybe it wasn't so easy to sell your Bitcoin for rubles in Moscow then, but it is today, right? So a lot of these critics that are trotting out arguments from 7-8 years ago, they're just wrong now. I mean, there's just this incredible liquidity. There are people very, very happy. There are people very, very, very happy to buy your Bitcoin from you in like pretty much any major capital on earth today.
Yeah. I mean, this is anecdotal. I don't have any hardline facts, but I would venture to say that Bitcoin is the most liquid, instrument in the world today. Like against the long tail of currencies, it's probably the most liquid. Maybe dollars is still more against the long tail, but Bitcoin's catching up really quickly, and it's extremely exciting to see. One of the listeners.
It's top 5 for sure, right? Because maybe you could find dollars or euros in a lot of these countries, but like you're not going to find like Saudi rials, right? Or like Argentine peso. You're not going to find smaller currencies halfway around the world. So it is this like bridge between monies. It's this sort of great monetary equalizer that's doing a lot of good.
Yeah, and it's permissionless, right? And that's what gives it its
Yeah,
edge,
well,
even though it might not be as liquid or as well known right now.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the listeners asking, as a pleb, potentially someone from a Western country, what can they do to help? How can they be a part of, uplifting human rights, maybe from a Bitcoin angle?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot that anyone can do that we don't even have to get into donating to these organizations or whatever. I mean, Bitcoin education is really key. There's still a lot of room for improvement in translation of, pick your favorite Bitcoin texts, whichever ones moved you. If you're a Bitcoin pleb today, if that's how you refer to yourself, someone obviously convinced you. You had the penny drop, and it may have been a Medium post or an article or a podcast. If you're able to somehow get that into a different language and get that out there, more power to you. That's like incredibly important. I would say also supporting or getting involved with free and open source tools that allow people to use and interact with Bitcoin in a more sovereign way, in an easy way, is a really great thing. So something like Spectre, for example, which makes things that might be kind of second level for new Bitcoiners, like multi-signature security and self-custody. I mean, like making it kind of, when you open this app, it's like fun, it's easy to use, it has a great user interface. These are things we need right now, right? So like, improving, UX around self-custody, privacy. I mean, if you can somehow contribute in some way to this, maybe you can give these developers a little bit of Bitcoin here and there as they work on their noble tasks. That's great. If you work in media and you can interview them and get their story out. I think a lot of people listening, maybe Bitcoin's their like hobby or their pastime, but their real job is like they work for some big company or they work in some other industry. If that industry is anything related to finance, you could always try to bring one of these developers in for a chat at your company and do, a fireside on what is it like to be a Bitcoin engineer? Like, tell us, like, what do you do?
Yeah.
Getting a bigger spotlight on developers, not just core, of course, core developers, but also the people who are building these tools that allow us to interact more easily with Bitcoin. I think all these things are easy low-hanging fruit for anybody, and not all of them require donations. I mean, there's a lot you can just do with your own networks and time.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and of course you can donate to HRF if you're in the West. It's tax advantaged, and there are many other organizations coming out. I know that Brink, which you guys are affiliated with, they are also working on providing a tax advantage way to donate to Bitcoin development. So Bitcoiners are always innovating on every level. It really impresses me. And I guess, do you want to talk a little bit about the HRF's like efforts within Bitcoin privacy and promoting kind of like dissident tech development specifically?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when we came out with the Bitcoin Development Fund, our first gift was to Chris Belcher for his work on CoinSwap, which is a tricky but very promising privacy upgrade that doesn't require any sort of Bitcoin doesn't require a new upgrade in Bitcoin software itself. I mean, it can be done right now. And his goal is to get that up and running and into wallets in the next year. And he had some major testnet news and announcements a couple of weeks ago. So y'all should be following what Chris is doing. But at the end of the day, we want to do our part to help ensure that Bitcoin remains a tool of financial freedom. And for that to be the case, it needs to be relatively private. It needs to have, I think we need to be aiming for pretty good privacy here. I mean, there's not going to be anonymity, then there's no auditability of the system. But we need to be able to have pretty good privacy and make ourselves not the lowest hanging fruit. And I think there's some awesome work being done by Matt Odell and others in his community, 6102 on Twitter. I mean, these folks are making guides for you to figure out how to use Bitcoin more privately. And you know what? Like, I think one of the big things is like this idea of like the bigotry of low expectations is actually a phrase from like the Bush administration. But it was this idea that like there's a lot of people out there who said that like Arabs or Chinese or Russians like couldn't have democracy or whatever, which is obviously nonsense. If you look at like Taiwan or South Korea or Tunisia or whatever, it was basically like thinly veiled racism, right? So there's a lot of people who are like, oh, well, like a lot of these Bitcoin critics who live in the West, who are living in these comfy apartments in New Jersey or whatever, like Krugman or whatever. I mean, they're like enjoying the trappings of our society, and they're like, well, people could never figure this out they'll make the mistake of calling Africa a country or something stupid like that. I mean, they're so disconnected. So what they don't understand is that like the Bitcoin users I've met who are from like Sudan, Syria, they take this shit super seriously. They're brilliant and they will figure it out. Do not assume less of your fellow man or woman depending on where they're from. They are equally as brilliant as you and they will figure this shit out. So let's not have this like bigotry of low expectations that like it's too hard to use Bitcoin. If Matt Odell and 6102 could figure it out, so could these other people. So just give them the educational materials, and they'll start to use Bitcoin again as a savings mechanism first. This is how people are doing it. They're figuring it out. They're realizing that they can escape their collapsing currency by opting into Bitcoin. Maybe they start sending it to family. Then eventually they're gonna get into a situation where they realize they want it to be more private. And then they're gonna seek to do that and implement that. They're gonna want to learn more about it and read more about it. And this is happening. But it's a process. I mean, people aren't getting into Bitcoin and immediately trying to figure out how to achieve pretty good privacy. This is not. That's just an ignorant way of looking at it. Like they first come into Bitcoin because of NGU technology, and then later they figure out this other stuff. So we need to do our best to get the educational materials out there, be a resource. And I know folks like 6102 are always out there saying they're willing to help anybody set up a node and use Bitcoin more privately. But let's dispense with the bigotry of low expectations here. There are plenty of Matt Odells in many other countries who are even smarter than Matt. Sorry, Matt, but even smarter than him. They're going to figure this shit out when they need to on their own terms. And the more we can spread this educational stuff, the better. But they're going to use it and they're going to protect themselves at the end of the day. And I've talked to countless people from many different countries who figured out self-sovereignty and pretty good privacy. And there will be many, many more like them.
All right. Well, I mean, kind of on that note, do you have any really inspiring stories from 2020 or that are top of mind? Not to put you on the spot.
I talked about it on Peter McCormick's pod, but it's worth dwelling on this one example, which is just shocking to me. Not shocking is the wrong word, but like really awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
From
It's
Belarus,
incredible.
this basically group of people in Belarus, young people, grassroots movement of hundreds of thousands of young Belarusians, many of whom live abroad. So Belarus is a low economic growth, very repressive, sort of Soviet-style dictatorship. So if you're like a young person there, you want to get the hell out. So many of them have. So like young entrepreneurial Belarusians have moved, and now they're living in Estonia, or they're living in Mountain View, starting companies in Silicon Valley or whatever. So there's like this huge, very brilliant, wealthy, empowered Belarusian diaspora, right? And they have been watching what's been happening to their country over the last decade. And this summer, they saw an opportunity and said, you know what, enough is enough. And they've had this dictator oppressing the people there for literally decades, since the Soviet times. And they want him gone. So while their brothers and sisters are like marching on the streets peacefully every day, it continues. I mean, hundreds of days after it started in August, and people, even though it's freezing out there, they continue to piss off the police and fluster the dictator, and they're not stopping. So these protests in Belarus continue to go. But this grassroots movement outside had money, and they said, we want to help, right? So what immediately they would do normally is like you would like wire a large amount of money from a European bank account to a Belarusian account controlled by your colleagues or whatever, and then they would like spend it on gas masks or organizing protests or whatever. Those transactions started to get frozen. They're kind of obvious. Like the government in Belarus knows, who owns what account, and they're watching for like large incoming wires, right? So a lot of those funds got frozen. So what one group called BYSOL, BYSOL, started to do, once they had raised literally like hundreds of thousands of dollars, some of which through HRF, we've helped them. I think we've given them close to $100,000 so far. What they've started to do is use Bitcoin. And it's interesting talking to these folks. They were not like, these are not Bitcoiners by heart. It's not like they were fans of Bitcoin. They were very skeptical of Bitcoin, let's put it that way. But as they say, once they saw that it worked, they became very excited about it. So what they've essentially been doing is getting around this like bank account freezing that the Belarusian government is doing by sending small amounts peer-to-peer directly to Belarusians. So what they do is right now in Belarus, what's really important is to strike against the regime. It's not an oil state. They get most of their income from industrial revenue. So people at these big plants are striking. And it's like putting a lot of pressure on the government in a peaceful way. It's like a really important thing to do. However, they still need to like feed their family while they're striking, and they're not getting their wages, right? So when you quit your job and strike. So what they do is they use Telegram to prove their identity to BYSOL, and they send in a bunch of photos, documentation, whatever. And then Bisol gives them like a one-time 1,500 euro grant so that they can continue to strike and keep the pressure on, keep the heat on, right? And again, that's not done through the banking system. They send Bitcoin directly to them on a peer-to-peer wallet. They use primarily it's called a trusty wallet. It's built by some Ukrainians. And it's a free, I believe it's a free open source wallet that they download. And then what happens is, it's very interesting. So 1,500 euros of Bitcoin goes onto their phone, and Bisol explains to these people how to do this. And again, bigotry of low expectations. Not a single person that they've sent money to has been confused about how to do this. They all figured it out, right? And then again, with the privacy thing, it's not entirely private. Like, yes, there's no KYC to use the app initially, but what they do is they put in their bank account number and routing number into the app. And behind the scenes, what they do is once they receive the euros, they sell, not everybody sells it, but some of them sell it into rubles because they need to go to the supermarket and buy food, right? So what they do is the Bitcoin arrives on the app on their phone, custody themselves. They have their own self-custody. And then what they do is maybe they sell a third of it off into rubles. And within less than an hour, the rubles are in their bank account. What's happening on the back end that they're not seeing is that some Russian or Ukrainian is buying their Bitcoin from them and then wiring the rubles to their bank account. So again, it's not perfectly private at all, but the government has no idea what's going on. I mean, what the government sees on their side is like lots of small transactions happening all across the nation. And anything smaller than a couple thousand euros, this is a very common, it could be a rent payment, who knows what. So they're watching like wires from the broader, economic region happening. They're not seeing anything big, and they're not doing timing analysis on the Bitcoin blockchain. They have no clue what's happening. So it's basically unstoppable aid to the striking workers. And it really, if the regime wanted to stop this, they'd have to shut down the whole banking system, which they can't do. So this has been really interesting for me to watch. And I just think you're going to see a lot more people start to realize this and implement it. But to see it happen on a national scale to the tune of almost $1 million so far that they've actually sent in via Bitcoin. And obviously it's crazy because think about how many people's lives have been changed. They were starting to do this when Bitcoin was selling for 10,000 US dollars, 12,000 US dollars. Yeah. I mean, now it's 33, 32, 34. I mean, you're talking about lives changing here just in the last few months. So, I mean, what's been happening there is worth reading about. We did a pod with Peter about it if you want to go more in depth. But again, here are people who were skeptical of Bitcoin and have figured out that, wow, this is something that like can really be useful in our struggle. And that's been very, very like an inspiring story for sure.
Yeah, no, that's extremely inspiring. And I mean, one thing just specifically, it just shows how incredible Bitcoin is as a peer-to-peer instrument, right? Like it is, if you're using Bitcoin peer-to-peer and you're transferring it from person to person, it is just a very, very powerful and incredible piece of technology. And I think that's where the value is. And some people, they just don't see past like the brokerage exchange interface.
No, and we could see where this is going. Like in 5 years, would you really? I mean, in 5 years, you could have these like non-KYC open source Lightning wallets, essentially. I mean, think about what's possible. I mean, it just blows the mind. If you think about what I just described, this is still under the constraints, if you want to call it that, of using the base layer of Bitcoin protocol, which again is still relatively slow, has relatively high fees, all these things. Even though today the fees are quite cheap and it still settles pretty quickly. But we're talking about being able to do it with much smaller fees instantly and much more privately. So that's why the Lightning Network is I think really important from a moral point of view. Whether or not it works from an economic and technical point of view is certainly still up for debate on a mass scale. But morally speaking, it would be incredible because it would like supercharge what I just described. Yep. And it's just very, very exciting. So certainly supporting people working on Lightning stuff is I think a very good thing to be doing right now from a human rights perspective.
Yeah, and with that, I mean, we're out of time. Alex, why don't you give your last words to the audience and final shout out for Bitcoin's birthday?
Keep your eyes out on what we're doing at Ahrefs. We're going to announce some new news in the coming couple weeks. A couple new projects that we're supporting out of the Dev Fund. We have some cool educational content coming out that we're working on with Reason Magazine that's going to come out in the next couple weeks. A couple exciting things. Thanks for having me on. Happy birthday, Bitcoin. Be your own bank. Remember, that's the revolution. So withdraw all that stuff into your own custody, and start doing that on a regular basis, and you'll reap the rewards later. But anyway, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for the time. Happy holidays, and yeah, we'll see you again probably very shortly on another Bitcoin Magazine production. And for all the viewers out there, stick around. We have some more fantastic programming. Up next is Matt Odell with Catan and Wiz, and then we have upping your Bitcoin privacy and sovereignty in 15 minutes, and then we're going to be giving away Bitcoin on marbles. So stick around for all of that. Thanks again, Alex, and on to the commercial break.